The PRovoke podcast, brought to you by PRovoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.
Welcome, everybody, to our latest PRovoke Media podcast. We are going to be discussing the PRovoke Global Summit, which took place last week in Washington, D.C., which already, in political terms at least, feels like a lifetime ago. But over the space of 4 days, we delivered some extremely cool content, he says modestly, and some big-name speakers. We covered a lot of territory, and in this conversation with two of our friends from Ogilvy, Drew Warren and Rachel Caggiano, we are going to be unpacking some of the key themes. First of all, welcome both of you. Do you want to quickly introduce yourselves, Rachel?
Sure. Well, thank you, Paul, for having us. My name is Rachel Caggiano. I'm the head of the Washington, D.C. office here, the Ogilvy office here in Washington, D.C., and was always grateful to have the summit here in our hometown.
And Paul, thanks for having us also. I'm Drew Warren. I lead our PR teams in North America at Ogilvy and spend a lot of my time across our integrated businesses. So thanks again for having us.
Great. So for me, the main thread that ran through the entire conference was about how business is engaging with societal issues in a politically polarized and rapidly changing world. And of course, it's changed even more in the days since we were together in DC. But certainly, there was a lot of questioning of our profession's embrace of purpose and of our advice to clients over the years. We heard from Nikki Haley that she felt companies should more and more stick to their knitting, I guess you'd say, and not risk alienating a slice of the consuming public. We heard from Michael Maslansky about the alienating impact of some of the language we've been using, particularly around ESG and DEI, and the potential for more inclusive language, like the language of responsibility, which is something we used to talk about all the time. And we also got some examples of companies that were finding ways to make purpose and values relevant both to their organizational leadership and to their stakeholders. And there was a lot to unpack there. I'm wondering, Rachel, sort of what you came away with as a sense of maybe what we've gotten wrong and what we can get right going forward.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. A lot has changed, but a lot has not changed, and as a communicator, I think, yes, the election has been decided and the electorate has made some decisions. But if you're a CCO or a CMO or a CEO, how much have your customers changed? Have their values changed? Have their, biases changed one bit? No, right? And so I think what was being talked about at the summit, this age-old tension between purpose and profit, and, I love the phrase you used, sticking to your knitting versus needing to stay true to your values, it's both a very current and relevant tension, but it's something that we've been talking about for years and we will continue to talk about into the future. That being said, I think there was very much a current of how do brands need to really know what their values are and use that as a North Star so that they don't alienate, needlessly customers or consumers that they shouldn't. But I think it's pretty naive to think that you're not going to offend anybody. What is it? Was it Abraham Lincoln who says you should probably plan to make 80% of the people happy 20% of the time and 20% of the people happy 80% of the time, or something like that? That's probably true for us as well.
Yeah, I thought that the Bayer session in particular, where Daniela Foster from Bayer talked about tying everything they do under the rubric of sustainability back into material impact, and she used the phrase material impact. It could have been a drinking game. So much that I think it really underscored that when you do this stuff right, it does in fact have a positive impact on the brand. That there are still a lot of consumers who want companies to stand for something rather than nothing.
And I thought that Sachin made a really good point, that sometimes it's just the terminology that can be a barrier for people. And so maybe it is okay and a worthy action that we all need to take to rethink the terminology. Is this an immediate stumbling block for somebody? But also, tying it back to the company's purpose or the quote unquote materiality. It actually is better for our business if we reduce our water footprint. It's not a moral thing. It's not a feel good thing. It's actually key to our business. Helping people to understand that, I think, takes away that posturing aspect or greenwashing aspect.
That's absolutely right, Rachel. And one thing I just want to add here that is a bit of the elephant in the room is that while, consumers are really looking for brands to take a stand on societal issues, the elephant in the room is that doing that without being political, there's tension there, right? If you take a stand on a societal issue at its core can be political and cannot and can rub some consumers the wrong way. So I think, to your point, a brand doing it in a way that's authentic to them is really critical. And we saw that in the Bayer session.
And it's so hard not to be political or not to be polarizing, right? Like using a Sharpie apparently can be a political act. Eating a Snickers bar has been, political in the past. I mean, it's hilarious, but also challenging. Like you just can't say that you can't be political.
Right. I mean, I think there was a period where the phrase "silence is complicity" was being used quite widely to describe companies that refused to get off the fence. And I think there's still a segment of the population that takes that view, that if you're not trying to solve a problem, you're part of the problem. Look, I'd sort of said I wasn't going to do this, and here I am. I'm going to break my own rules, because why would you be a editor if you couldn't do that? But you picked up our Creative Agency of the Year at the Global SABREs, and you won 2 Global SABREs for your work with Dove. And I would say that work, the sort of Black Hair is Professional campaign, for example, is a great example of what we're talking about here. It's very true to the brand. It's a space in which Dove and Unilever clearly have permission to speak, because they've been in that space producing that product for so long. And it's a great example of how you can, in fact, get involved with a social issue without a massive backlash. I don't think it's created problems for Dove on a sort of industrial scale, right?
Yeah, that's correct, Paul. And what we've really done and what we've been focused on, and what you saw from all 3 of these campaigns was that they addressed social issues in some way. It wasn't us, posturing or putting out a statement. What we really did is we used creativity, specifically earn first creativity, to drive impact and really, shine a light on something that deserves the spotlight. So you'll see more of that work coming out of Ogilvy, and it's something that we're quite proud of.
And Paul, you bring up a really good point that, Dove didn't just start speaking and advertising to Black women in 2023. The idea of real beauty and their brand platform is something that we've been working with them on for 60 years, and they've very not just authentically shown up, but done the work over time. And, I think that's also just a really important aspect of, we throw around the term authenticity, but really is showing up over time, putting your mouth where your money is, walking the walk, talking the talk.
Right. The other thing that I think was a pretty sort of consistent thread throughout the event was the focus on the way in which the media landscape is evolving. And I think to a certain extent that too ties back to the political environment at the time of the conference, because we were seeing both candidates really engaging with podcasts with very distinct and discrete audiences, in some cases more aggressively or more overtly than they had with the traditional mainstream or corporate media. We had plenty of representation from what I would call next gen media at the event. And I'm interested in sort of what's changed and what hasn't. Obviously, there's a much wider range of sort of channels to communicate with. But at the same time, it seems to me that the power of storytelling remains undiminished and maybe not much changed. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's not just that there are more channels, right? And, more social, more digital. I think there's also a big change in, obviously, I'm not going to say the death of mainstream, but mainstream is not mainstream, right? It's a clickbait headline, but, the podcast, election or the presidential podcast election, there's so much more beyond that, though. Like, who would have thought that 3 or 4 years ago we would be talking about Twitch streams and Kick streams, a presidential candidate appearing on that. So gaming, but also more immersive things like VR. But I think it also shows that from a storytelling perspective, people want unfiltered information and unfiltered access to stories and people and experiences. They're willing to sit through 3.5 hours of a rambling conversation. Okay. They really, I think it's also part of a reaction against cancel culture, this desire for grittiness, realness, etc. And then we also can't forget about how influencers or content creators have radically changed storytelling as well. What is it? Over 200 creators being credentialed at the Democratic convention and 70 at the Republican. That is massively different than we've ever seen. It was only ever traditional media being credentialed. And so you're getting so many different forms and it's so unfiltered. And this is how, they're reaching younger people who don't want the traditional mainstream filter.
Yeah, you make a terrific point. It must be a symptom of my advancing age that I think of the Washington Post as mainstream media before I think of Joe Rogan. But if you look at the sheer numbers, right? There's no question who's more mainstream and who's more niche. And during the course of our conference, the Washington Post became 10% less mainstream.
Yeah.
That's interesting. But do you have to tell stories differently for these new channels? Are the rules different?
I can take this one. The short answer is yes. And I think as communicators, we grew up in this industry being taught to stick to message, have a tight messaging strategy, to know your audience, know how to speak to your audience. And really what you're seeing today is the days of relying on traditional media are over. And it's really a mix of things. It's a mix of things. It's traditional media. And I don't even know that you would call it new media when you look at things like, TikTok strategies, podcast strategies. But the thing that you have to do right now is approach by audience and approach by actual media. Rachel was mentioning podcasts and getting on a podcast for 3 hours. There's no way that can be scripted and tight on message. The thing that the consumer likes when they're listening to podcasts like that is the unfiltered raw approach, and that's much different in the way that we would approach what was for a long time considered traditional media.
Right.
So, sorry, Rachel, did you have?
Oh, I was agreeing with Drew just in the sense that, a 3-hour conversation, preparing for that is much different than preparing for like a 60-minute interview. But, Paul, to answer your question or to think about your question a little bit more in terms of like, has storytelling changed? I mean, yes and no, like we're humans and stories, but we're always going to want a villain and a hero. And, we're always going to want, a narrative arc. So I think things like that haven't changed. But, when I sit scrolling on TikTok at night, I'm fascinated at the creativity and just the niche aspect of how people love taking people along with them. Get ready with me. I have 10 seconds in the car. It's very brief. It's very intimate. It's very raw. It's very unscripted, and I think people really have a yearning for that.
Is it reasonable to expect that CEOs are going to be willing to do that kind of unscripted free? I mean, there's a lot that can go wrong in 3 hours, right? You can't stay on message consistently for 3 hours. And look, we saw just how sort of divergent the candidates were able to be in that format. And I think it was humanizing and authentic in a lot of ways. But do you get the sense that there are corporate leaders out there who are willing to trade message control and consistency for a little more authenticity in formats like that?
Well, let's not forget that his media relations person very carefully selected which podcast he was going to be on, so shout out to the media relations people who are still doing their jobs.
Fair enough. Again, almost inevitably, given what the last sort of 12 months, couple of years have brought along, there was a lot of discussion at the event about AI. On the first day, there was a fairly robust sort of almost dismissal of of generative AI. I'm sorry. And an enthusiasm for cognitive AI. This feeling that, there's going to be generative, but it's going to just make our lives easier and we need to embrace it. But cognitive is what's going to make a huge difference in terms of message testing and campaign strategy and red teaming and all of that. Then we had a discussion of AI in the newsroom and a fairly sort of impassioned case that AI is going to be useful there as well, but that it's not going to break stories or come up with scoops or, replace great reporting. And then we had our first robot on stage at a PRovoke conference and a discussion with an AI taking place on stage. And I found all of that somewhere between interesting and entertaining, I guess. But what did you come away from in terms of, your understanding about how AI is going to change both the media environment and the PR business?
I think everybody agreed that it's going to improve productivity. And, people use good analogies like it's the next Google, or think about it as your intern, things to help us wrap our heads around it. But there were, overwhelming agreement. Like it's not going to replace human creativity. It's not going to replace that human touch or whatever. It's going to help us enhance it. But we still need humans to do the really important decision making.
I can give a real life example of that, actually, Rachel. Like, even just a few years ago, we were using at the time what was called predictive analytics. And Paul, you probably heard that being thrown around a lot 5 years ago. Now, in practice, we're using, AI tools that are helping assist our teams with social listening and dissecting what is actually happening socially. We're using it for monitoring purposes where we can actually take 800 pieces of coverage and distill down into 5 bullet points of not only what are the key narrative themes that we're seeing, but how is the narrative shifting day by day, month by month. So to Rachel's point, using AI really for efficiency, innovation, and speed is the thing that we have at our advantage right now. And it's something that, people are starting to embrace more and more to be additive to the team, not as a threat to our talent.
Yeah, and I think the more and more we as communicators and clients also get comfortable with using AI to, mine better insights that we humans can then use, for creative ideas, but also pushing briefs and even, thinking about synthetic test scenarios or focus groups. It's pretty amazing to think about how it can really help us to do things more smart, more fast.
Yeah, that to me is what seems exciting about AI is its ability to make us smarter, faster, and its ability to make us more accurate in our prediction of how positions and messages are likely to land. The AI is coming for your job has, I think, been slightly overblown in our business.
Yes, we like to overreact sometimes, don't we?
Well, and look, I mean, when your livelihood is at stake, I guess it's understandable to prioritize that aspect. But I think we've probably, as an industry, reached a point where we've figured out how it can make people, as you say, Rachel, more productive and less bogged down in minutiae, and free them to focus on more strategy, more creativity, which is what we all want at the end of the day.
Correct. I mean, the calculator probably put some people out of a job, and Google probably put some research assistants out of a job. But, look at us. We're innovating, and we'll figure this out.
Right. I wanted to sort of wrap up this conversation by talking about what we saw in the global SABRE Awards, and a little bit about your being named Global Creative Agency of the Year, those two things being obviously interconnected. You had sort of 3 campaigns, I think, in our top 20 of the year, 2 in our top 5, is that right? And so obviously it's been a good year for Ogilvy. And I wanted to touch on something that a couple of people had mentioned to me as we were going through the SABRE Awards, which was that there were a lot of campaigns in there this year that were just more about fun than they were about purpose. It's a little weird talking about this because, as we've just said, 2 of your American campaigns, the Dove campaigns, were clearly purpose-driven. And there was a campaign from Ogilvy, Pakistan, that was equally purpose-driven. But I think the campaign that most people think about when they think about Ogilvy this year is the Michael CeraVe campaign around the Super Bowl earlier this year, which happened too late to have been a Provoke SABRE winner this year. I'm sure it'll be in the mix next year. But that was sort of an example of moving somewhat away from purpose and more towards just delivering a really fun experience for consumers. Is that something you think we've seen more of and will see more of going forward?
I think that you're going to see both, Paul, and it really comes down to the client briefs that we're getting. We've got some work that's going to come out this winter that's both fun and impactful. I do think that, one of the things that was so successful about the Michael CeraVe work was that it was, earned first at its core. And we were earned first, but we were still able to drive brand and product messaging about, made by dermatologists, which was core to that campaign. I do think that when we talked earlier about how we're reaching consumers and reaching them in new channels, there's no better example than the Michael CeraVe campaign, because it actually all started with a, quote unquote, tongue-in-cheek fake news campaign that we used influencers to try to convince the internet that, wait a second, did Michael CeraVe actually create CeraVe? So we definitely had fun with that one, but in the end, we really delivered a key product and brand message for the CeraVe brand.
Yeah, and I think as much as we all love focusing on, the socially impactful work and the purposeful work, and I do think because of what's happening in our country, we're going to be seeing a lot of really interesting briefs coming out this year. But I also think about humor and fun also as a public service as well in these times, and also talking to a lot of brands that, maybe their role right now is, to offer a little bit of levity or, celebrate simple joys of coming together or just having people laugh a little bit. Those can be really important during times like this as well.
Yep.
And in addition to those sort of individual campaigns that we've been talking about, the other thing that sort of put Ogilvy over the top for me in terms of the creative agency of the year was the fact that you have sort of a structured sort of trademarked approach with the whole immersive idea, and that you've been able to implement that across campaigns for multiple clients. I mean, certainly CeraVe, certainly Dove, certainly Coca-Cola, some of the work that we've seen for Coke over the last year. Tell us a little bit about immersive and what that means and how it guides the creative process.
Yeah, one of the things that you're seeing, in market right now that's coming direct from Ogilvy is our belief that, we're not just a PR agency or a social agency or an influencer shop or a creative shop. Uh, we're all of those things, and we've really put together PR, social, and influence in a tightly wound, integrated way. And we've really fused that into the creative powerhouse that is Ogilvy. And what that has done, Paul, is it has allowed us to tap into consumers, to immerse them in the brand in a way that you don't, right now at least, see other agencies or in-house teams doing. What that's done is it's allowed us to really unlock the way that consumers are engaging with the brand. You know this from your own, consumption habits, that you're not reading, a PR message or a social message or a way that you're engaging through an influencer. The more that is consistent and you're telling a, cohesive story across channels, what better way than to bring people in a deep capacity?
Yeah, and one of the things that I'm proudest of in seeing the way Ogilvy's work and culture even evolving is we're seeing so much more PR-led marketing and a greater adoption and understanding and appreciation and love of earned first thinking across the entire organization. And so, as those of us who've been deep in the PR craft for years and years, it's very, it's very heartening to see that this is what is resonating with consumers. This is what is winning awards, but this is what is impacting and creating some social good in the world as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've seen the rise of earned first over a period of years. I guess what excited me this year was that the earned first work that really struck me. CeraVe is one. There was a campaign that one of your competitors did in the UK for Specsavers using Rick Astley.
Yeah.
That sort of struck me the same way because it was just a fun, joyous, celebratory, sort of laugh out loud campaign. And not only were they earned first, but they were earned first and created by firms that have their roots in the earned space, right? So we were seeing a lot of earned first work that came out of ad agencies. And I'm certainly not, given that you're part of Ogilvy, going to ask you to badmouth ad agencies. But for me, at least, and I hope for you, it was refreshing to see that PR agencies and PR people can come up with the insight, can drive the campaign, that can produce paid components to an earned first campaign out of a PR agency. That to me was what made this a breakthrough year creatively.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Paul. The thing that we are seeing right now coming out of last year is that the majority of our inbound briefs that we're getting from clients, or the thing that they're reaching out to us to talk about, is earned first as a table stake. It's no longer being viewed as earned to amplify. It's how do we build ideas and drive creativity with earned and social and influence at the center. The work you've seen come out of Ogilvy this year has been exactly that. You're going to continue seeing that. And I think that, frankly, within the walls of our own organization, we've definitely built some street cred that we're really excited to continue on and help shape the industry and drive the PR industry forward.
Right. Okay. Thank you for your time, both of you. Thank you for your partnership on this event. I'm glad that you got as much out of the summit this year as we did. We certainly found it incredibly stimulating and the source of a ton of content. And for those who can't plow through the 20 or so stories that we published over the course of the the entire event. Hopefully this wrap up gives a good overview of sort of what the big themes and topics were. Thanks, Drew. Thanks, Rachel. Lovely to have you.
Thank you, Paul.
Likewise. Thanks, Paul.
You've been listening to the Provoke podcast, brought to you by Provoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.